Security as a basis for a Palestinian settlement. A 40-minute presentation held at the Defence Academy on the 25th of November 2009. The presenter is John Deverell.
Whether you're a historian, whether you're interested in religion, whether you're interested in current affairs, whether you're interested in social history, the Bible, anything else, international law, it's got something for everybody. So I'm just going to tell a couple of quick stories to set the scene. And please forgive me, I don't mean to offend anybody by telling these stories, but the first story is about God and President Reagan and Gorbachev and Yasser Arafat. And God called each of them in, one after the other, and he said, I'm going to give you one wish. And Reagan said, God, what I'd like, please, is democracy around the world, but benign democracy, accepting differences around the world. And God said, I'm sorry, Mr. Reagan, not in your lifetime. So Mr. Reagan went out crying. And then Gorbachev asked what he wanted. He said, well, not even communism, God, but just socialism around the world. I'm sorry, Mr. Gorbachev, not in your lifetime. Went out crying. Yasser Arafat came in. God, compared to those two gentlemen, I just want something really small, really, really simple for you to provide. All I want is a self-ruling small patch of ground called Palestine to be allowed to stand on its own feet. And God said, Mr. Arafat, I'm sorry, not in my lifetime. And but on a slightly more optimistic note, the rabbi who's asked whether or not he was an optimist, he said, yes, of course I'm an optimist. I believe that today will be better than tomorrow. So I will try and be non-judgmental. I will try and look as appropriate at perceptions of both sides, so to speak, to simplify things. And one can see from the Israeli point of view, they are truly surrounded. And despite the fact they've roundly defeated, albeit things have been a bit tight once or twice, roundly defeated all their neighbours at various times, you can understand, given just the geography, a certain amount of the paranoia. Again, there, the West Bank, neatly sandwiched between Israel in red and Jordan, and the Gaza, not even marked, but again, most of you will know that the Gaza is just there. As my quartermaster would have said, I need to rattle through a few of the histrionics. You can't do without the histrionics. The first thing was, people who became the Jews came in from outside. That's the first point to note, from what is now southern Iraq. And it was the promised land. The Palestinians will joke and say, yeah, we accept that God told the Jews that it was the promised land for them, but it was a shame he forgot to tell us as well. And over the years which succeeded the establishment of the Jewish people, there were a series of banishments, of exiles, notably the Assyrians, followed by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC, who destroyed the temple, and that's why Herod rebuilt the temple, and that was the second temple. And then the Persians, Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, and then Judas Maccabeus, who managed to retrieve and re-establish a Jewish kingdom. So a whole series of times when the Jews have come in and been pushed out and banished and exiled. And then, of course, Jesus Christ himself, and he was different things to different people. He saw himself and was seen by many as a prophetic fulfillment from the Old Testament, fulfillment from the prophecies of the Old Testament. And, of course, given Judas Maccabeus, given that the Jews were again in a subordinate position, people saw him as the man who would help, again, the Jewish people rise against, in this case, the Romans, who by then had come in and had occupied the place. Various Jewish uprisings, and then, of course, the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70 by the Romans. And then Constantine the Great comes in the 4th century. In 312 AD, Constantine legalizes Christianity. In 324 AD, Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And what has largely been a sort of, I wouldn't say underground religion, but quite a furtive religion, becomes established, and Christianity, in many ways, as we know it today, comes to pass. But it was in the early days, and the Orthodox Christians, the Eastern Christians out there, would still argue a Hellenistic religion in the Byzantine mould, and that was all fine and well. The Jews have been pushed out again, have been pushed away from holy places such as Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and have gone out, pushed out to areas like the Galilee. And then the Caliph, the Khalifa means in Arabic the successor, the Caliph Omar, the second successor after Muhammad the Prophet, then comes in 638 AD, and Jerusalem is handed over peacefully. And again, it's the most intriguing story for those of you who are interested, with Sophronius, who was a patriarch in Jerusalem, coming out and giving him the keys if he would allow the Christians to have freedom of religion in Jerusalem and the other holy places. And so the result of that, you had 3 religions and 3 peoples, all living in very, very close juxtaposition. The Christians were given what is called a dhimma, so essentially a subordinate but protected status. And the Arabs today, the Muslims today, regard all 3 peoples as al-Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book. And of course they have shared DNA. I don't know enough about DNA, but it'd be fascinating to delve into it, and I could guarantee, in fact I know it is the case, that the people who live today in the Holy Land, of all stations, the Christians, who sadly today only represent 2%, and the Jews and the Muslims, call each other cousins. They are literally cousins, and no doubt individual families have been through all those religions, and one after another have, as the next lot have come in, have accommodated and changed. So you had three people living in uneasy juxtaposition. At various times, one side or one element or another was dominant. And then you had Zionism began to be quite a strong, more coherent movement towards the end of the 19th century. And Theodor Herzl, in 1897, initiated the first Zionist Congress. And the rising pressure for the Jews to have their own homeland once again led to the Balfour Declaration, Balfour being British Foreign Secretary in 1917. Still a thing, of course, people have long memories that the Palestinians particularly remember, and they're not particularly happy with it, and they say, yeah, we can understand it in a way, but why didn't he also say something about the homeland for us, the Palestinians? And then, of course, you had the First World War. You had Allenby, who took Jerusalem in 1917, and also became the first governor thereafter. And in 1920, the British Mandate was established, which was essentially an administrative necessity, and under increasing tensions caused by both sides, the British found themselves between a rock and a hard place. Then, of course, the Holocaust, and today the Palestinian perception is that, yeah, they understand what happened. Most of them don't deny it did happen, but of course they say, why should we suffer for what was in essence a European problem? The UN made various blueprints for the borders between the two sides, and in May 1948, 15th of May 1948, the State of Israel was created, was founded, and literally the following day, the 16th of May, war was declared, and the surrounding Arab countries declared war on the State of Israel. It led, as you know, to a victory, what the Arabs today call Nakba, i.e. the catastrophe, so called because not only was it a defeat, but also because of the exodus of a huge number of refugees from what was already Israel, who ended up in various surrounding countries, including in the West Bank, and those are today's refugee camps, and of course they are far more numerous than they were then, because they've all had children and they had children and so on and so forth, and that is an abiding problem which I'll return to in a moment. And we were left with a situation post-48 where the Jordanians, often forgotten, controlled East Jerusalem and also the West Bank. We then had the Six-Day War in 1967. There was a lot of advice in the aftermath of victory by the Israelis. There was a lot of advice from key elements of the Israeli political establishment that the West Bank should not be occupied. Indeed, Moshe Dayan himself took quite a lot of convincing. I think the official line, or certainly papers written by Shin Bet at the time, said, look, guys, we don't need this, we don't need to occupy this, it's going to be a mistake if we do, and that actually we should allow the Palestinians a degree of autonomy. Anyway, it didn't happen, it was occupied, the settlements grew from the early 1970s and led to what is called officially the occupation, and the Israelis will admit to that, and what the residual Christians in the West Bank described as a double occupation under both the Muslims and the Israelis. And then, of course, the Intifadas. The second Intifada has been the one which has had greater ramifications. In many ways, there was quite a lot of economic coming and going. Things economically, to a certain extent, were working. There was, for instance, where I lived 15 months in Ramallah, the capital of the West Bank. Before the second Intifada, a lot of Israelis would actually go there for weekends. It's quite a high altitude, nearly 3,000 feet, pleasant climate. They go there to eat and things like that. And there's a certain amount of trade, constrained but a certain amount of trade. But a lot of tension at the same time, and what triggered the second Intifada was Sharon's walk to the Temple Mount, accompanied by about 200 of his closest mates, and that essentially triggered it off. And also, in due course, led to a series of suicide bombs. I think about 30 serious big suicide bombs in places like Tel Aviv, up to about 2003, followed by a mass policy to stop doing that, because of course it was a double-edged weapon. That in itself had led to assassinations, what the Israelis would regard as preemptive self-defense. And Sharon, probably one of the few people who could have pulled it off as a hard liner, who had the strength of character and the position to do it, then said, right, we will get out of Gaza. Hugely unpopular with the settlement movement, said we'll do it. And we'll also get out of 4 settlements in the northern part of the West Bank. In 2006, and it's interesting to speculate and talk to people who knew him, who worked with him, to work out what his longer-term game plan would have been if he hadn't been rented comatose. And then, under US pressure, because a lot of Palestinians, Fatah certainly said, the Palestinian Authority, largely composed of Fatah, said it's dangerous to have elections because there's a a real chance Hamas will actually do possibly quite well. The US said, no, you should be having elections, we want to show democracy and. So elections were held against some people's better judgment. Hamas won a lot of seats in that particular election, and for a period it worked. There was a unity government of sorts, a certain amount of mutual suspicion, but the ministerships were shared out. And then in 2007, in May 2007, all went horribly wrong, and Gaza was forcibly seized from the Palestinian Authority by Hamas, which has led effectively to what we have now in Gaza. Here's just a few personal photographs. I'm sorry these are not very dramatic, exciting photographs, but just illustrate a few things as we saw them. This is actually quite a low part of the so-called fence around the West Bank. This is where it bisects the area between Ramallah and Jerusalem. These two houses are either side of the fence. In fact, the houses belong to the same family, but the fence in a particularly insensitive way has gone between the two, and very hard for those people to see each other now. This is a settlement, the edge of a settlement down towards Hebron, and I went to see a Bedouin settlement, which is just below to one side, probably been there hundreds of years, and the security guards who are employed by the settlers shoot at the Bedouin if they come and try and get water from the sort of traditional waterhole down here. If they try and do it in the day, they get shot at. And then this is OCHA, for those of you who are interested in websites and things like that, OCHA, the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, as part of the UN, has an office in Jerusalem, on the east-west line in Jerusalem. And they produce every week or every month these very good maps which show the latest update in terms of impediments to movement and things like that in the West Bank. Remembering the West Bank itself is about 100 miles from north to south. It's about the same size as one English county above another. And if it weren't for the checkpoints, one could drive from top to bottom in about 2 hours. And again, it's very narrow indeed as well, so in some places less than 25 miles. And all these shaded areas are essentially where Palestinians can't go. The green line, which is colloquially called the Green Line, is where the UN in the end set the boundary between the West Bank and the State of Israel. And these indents here show where the fence or wall has actually bitten into large chunks of the West Bank, effectively in order to protect the settlements and the settlers. For instance, Ariel is a particularly big settlement, 30,000 people, from the rest of the West Bank, and also link them in to Israel. So quite big chunks, and again you see the whole Jordan Valley is very fertile farming, unlike most of the West Bank, and again largely occupied and used by the Israelis for agricultural purposes, but using typically Palestinian labour. So just a few implications of the occupation. 100 plus settlements, nearly 250,000 people between West Bank and East Jerusalem, and incidentally under international law those settlements are regarded as illegal. 600 checkpoints, or over 600 checkpoints, or other obstacles to movement. And indeed, the food prices in Ramallah were different to the food prices just 30 miles away in Nablus, and so on and so forth, because basically even the farmers and certainly people who bought the food did not have freedom of movement to go and buy wherever they wanted to buy. The fence I've talked about already, removing swathes of the West Bank. Again, up to about 2002 2003, huge numbers of people used to come and go as a labour force. And for instance, the Gazans, a large amount of them used to work in Israel every day and would go back, basically commuting in and out. All that stopped, so huge economic damage. For instance, something we used to get involved in quite a lot was to try to ease the passage of goods between the West Bank and Israel in the interests of trade and prosperity and supporting the moderates. And for instance, all trucks have to be offloaded and reloaded onto another truck. You can't drive a truck through despite modern scanners and things like that. I think one of the biggest tragedies in human terms, and one thing which makes it difficult looking ahead, is the fact that historically, I mean even going back before the Second Intifada, people saw a lot of each other, and there was a certain mutual understanding on a good day between quite a lot of people. But because they now see each other very little, the basis of having empathy, which I would say is the basis for coming to a common understanding, is even less there now than before. The Cinderella syndrome is all about the constraints imposed upon the Palestinian Authority security forces, who, even in their own cities, which are called Area A, Areas B and C being under Israeli administration, but being part of the West Bank, even in Areas A, their own cities like Ramallah, like Nablus, like Jenin, like Bethlehem, like Jericho, are not allowed freedom of movement to go about their business in terms of trying to make the place law-abiding. And typically, after midnight and up to first light, that's when the Palestinian security forces are not allowed on the streets, and that is when the Israelis typically come in and run their agents, do their raids, do their sort of lifts of people, things like that. It has, under some pressure, got slightly better, but not for nothing is it called the Cinderella syndrome. And essentially the sins of a few visited on the many, so whilst there are some bad boys, they all get to suffer. And of course there is underlying all this the risk of the intifada, which means in Arabic the uprising, starting again. So the core issues, again, a lot of you will know this, so probably worth reiterating, those are the four core issues. People know what the end game needs to look like. There is wide agreement on that. The trouble is, the eternal question is how on earth do you get there? And you see them written out there. Again, many attempts to find peace, and rightly so, and just a number of milestones. And most recently, depressingly I would argue, the inability of Obama to get Netanyahu to agree to a full freeze for 12 months on settlements. And incidentally, natural growth, which the Israeli government talks about, in fact that growth is actually an appreciable amount more than natural growth in the population in the rest of Israel, so one can be quite cynical about that as well. For those of you who go on the internet, a few really worthwhile sites to look at, funded by the British government. Shooting Back, a clever title, because here you have Palestinian farmers given video cameras funded by the British in order to film what is happening to them at the hands of some of the settlers who are making it difficult for the olive harvest, burning olive trees, that sort of stuff, etc. Breaking the Silence is a very interesting one, and this actually was funded by people in the Israeli Defense Force who, looking back on their own service in places like Hebron typically, where they were essentially guarding the very hardline settlers who occupied the middle of Hebron, recanted effectively and decided what they were doing was actually really wrong, and formed Breaking the Silence, which also includes some serving members of the IDF. And Otsha is worth looking at as well for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Here we come on to the nuts and bolts. The top bullet point is really key. A growing US realization that the Israelis, legitimately and understandably, are very concerned about their insecurity, surrounded as they are by Arab nations, and again looking at Iran's saber-rattling, and also looking at Hamas's unwillingness, certainly publicly, to concede the right of existence of Israel. And therefore the US have realized that concern has to be allayed. And one of the people we used to work with a lot, because it's a very small space, there's a lot of international bodies working there, was General Jim Jones, who had his own mission out there, and his main task was to try to help the Israelis come to a different understanding of how their security, in particular looking east, so through the West Bank and beyond, could actually be dealt with by some clever technical fixes without the Israelis needing to continue to occupy the West Bank for that purpose. Because obviously high ground between Israel and the Jordan and looking beyond Jordan. And Jim Jones, incidentally, as I think most people know, is now the National Security Advisor. So, again, gave us hope that with the new American administration and a number of similarly thinking people who had experience, there would be a full court press for some sort of peace, but as always, it's not quite so easy. And then Arafat, typically of most, if not all, Middle Eastern leaders, but he did it to an extreme. The whole business, those of you who know Middle Eastern countries, typically you have this sort of stovepiped security force system where they don't really talk to each other. Jointry, in our terms, is not really a concept they're particularly keen on, they're particularly used to, and it's divide and rule, so essentially it's a sort of legacy of wanting to defend against a coup, i.e. the assumption is the forces will not easily join together in order to overthrow. And an absolutely key statement at the bottom, Bush, realising that actually things had to happen, there was a real case for reform, which also would help the top bullet point as well. And again, General Dayton, who was a person who guys like Gareth and I were working for as a US security coordinator. Again, note that this is now his fourth year unaccompanied in Jerusalem, and rather belittles the typical length of tour for us. Okay, he does get to go home occasionally to Washington, but nonetheless a different way of looking at things in terms of continuity and establishing relationships. Really Dayton laying out what he was there to do. Again, a few snaps. Some of you will know Lieutenant Colonel Hugh Evans, this guy here, and a very good man, Dr. Sami Musallam, who's very well educated, very fine governor of Tubas in the West Bank, a bunch of police guys, another guy on our staff over there on the right, Rami, and again, just to give you a sense of what these guys look like, really. Again, continuing that, and here, absolutely key statement by General Ashkenazi, the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Defense Forces, who said, as the Palestinians do more, so will we do less. And really, we took that as our ethos. If we can help the Palestinians do more in a more competent way, in a more joined-up way, then so will the Israelis have less reason to stay as in their current profile on the West Bank. That was in essence the concept, or is the concept behind this combined force of the Americans, the Canadians and the British, in order to help in particular on two things. Firstly, to train the national security forces. The Palestinians are not allowed an army. This is essentially a gendarmerie, and the Americans hit on this scheme with Jordanian help of training a battalion at a time of them in Jordan. The Israelis themselves, seeing this would ultimately help Israeli security, have facilitated this and have been very good about it, and have also commented that security, because of more professionalism on the Palestinian side in the West Bank, has got better, which directly and indirectly helps them, the Israelis. So, mutual interest there. And then the other main thing they were doing, USC has been to empower the Ministry of the Interior by essentially providing with an engine room of international people working closely with Palestinians to reform from the inside. And Condoleezza Rice described the whole effort as an example of smart power. Again, slightly closer up, I'm really doing this to remind you of the location of a few of the key places. Jenin in the north. Jenin historically has always survived, or historically survived, by its position trading to and fro. There's a lot of Israeli Arabs who live in Israel on this side, who basically were people from the 48 war who stayed put in Israel. And historically, before the Second Intifada, a lot of them used to come in across that green line in order to trade, buy, sell, things like that. Nablus, the economic powerhouse in many ways, certainly the northern part of the West Bank, Ramallah, and you see there Jerusalem, essentially, although under international law should be the capital of, East Jerusalem should be the capital of the West Bank, and yet you see through the settlements effectively largely cut off from the West Bank, and that's why the settlements are such a key issue to solve. And then Bethlehem and Hebron in the south. Again, just a few snaps. That is Nablus, hitherto very prosperous, surrounded by about 60 villages. Again, historically, before the Second Intifada, that place made its money by supplying the needs of 60 villages. The villagers of 60 villages find it very difficult to get there now. The Israelis have eased up a bit, but the checkpoints surrounding Nablus don't make it easy, so lots of businesses have now gone bust. And certainly on this one, for those who are interested in biblical stuff, this is Mount Gerizim up here, which is where the Sumerians, as a small Jewish sect, very inbred, still survive today. The only element of Jewish people who still sacrifice, their view was that the Ark of the Covenant, in its slow progress, as per the Old Testament, southwards to end up in Jerusalem at the temple, stopped here for a few years, and the argument was after leaving there, it then passed into the hands of an illegitimate priesthood who was not qualified to look after it, not directly descended from Amos, the previous high priest, and therefore they said, we'll do our own stuff, and they continue even to this day to celebrate Passover by slaughtering newborn lambs on top of this hill. Not an irrelevant point, because it just shows that this Jewish sect, regarded as heretical by an Orthodox Jew, are actually able to live quite happily cheek by jowl, unprotected, amongst a bunch of Palestinians, a few Christians, but mainly Muslims. So there we are, a bit of history. Now coming on to what I was doing there personally, I had been working, on a personal note, I'll tell you, I was working as Director of Defence Diplomacy in the MOD, looking after, amongst other things, all the defence attaches, and under the burden of reductions in MOD funding, and also the FCO deciding to pull its money from supporting DAs. DAs have been very reduced. I decided I couldn't really do any more by staying there, and so with the help of my very good friend, Colonel Mark Rollo Walker, who is leaving now, a very accomplished defence attaché in Tel Aviv, and the fact I worked for General Dayton before when he was looking for the elusive weapons immediately after the 2003 war in Iraq, I went out to work for him, and Mark Rollo Walker and I cobbled together an understanding that it would be very good if I could get myself forward in Ramallah, which hadn't been done to date. The rest of the USSC was based back in Jerusalem. The benefits of that being both presentational and practical, because it meant, for instance, that I could just literally walk 5 minutes down the road to go and see the Minister of the Interior, for instance, who looked after quite a lot of these forces. I didn't have to get in some sort of heavily protected convoy to drive there. They could sense that I was among them, and vice versa. But the Americans could not do that, because they'd had a few people working for the US government who'd been murdered in Gaza a few years before that, so were working under heavier constraints than us in that regard. So both the British authorities and General Dayton agreed that I could work forward. The Israelis themselves were very concerned about that. A lone European army guy in the West Bank, what was he doing, what was he undermining? And in that regard, the link with the US was very important, in that General Dayton could allay Israeli concerns and made it quite clear I was working for the Americans, which of course made it more palatable from the Israeli point of view. I was in an interesting position in many ways, because it was obviously in my interest to begin to build relationships with the Israelis as well, and so I did. Not always easy. They are suspicious, and they can point to that being the case with good reason from their point of view. I went down to visit Gaza as an example, and the senior Israelis could not believe that I had gone to Gaza for any other reason than talk to Hamas. And when I said to them bona fide that I had gone down to look at the 2 British war cemeteries there, they found that completely incredible, that I could waste my time doing anything like that. And we made the point that actually if I had been speaking to Hamas, because British government servants are not allowed to, I would be on the next plane home from a British point of view. And again, it took General Dayton to enable me to reopen my relationships, which were very important in terms of talking to the civil authority of the Israelis, the occupation civil authority outside Ramallah and elsewhere. And again, what I was able to do because of my existence there was both to support and help existing efforts by General Dayton and his guys, and also suggest new ones. Chief of the Defence Staff back in MOD here had said that he wanted to be told whenever any British officer was assigned to go and work anywhere other than Afghanistan or Iraq. And so, of course, that was translated by the people lower down that no British officers could go anywhere other than they were already assigned to go, so a very small handful in Jerusalem, such as guys. And so that meant that I couldn't have, when I got authority to build a team, I could not have serving officers. In a way, I got the best of both worlds, because I was able to write the job specs and interview and get contractors, many of whom had had useful experience before, 2 of whom were very good linguists. And these were the areas in which I decided, with General Dayton's support, that we needed to do more in order to complement existing efforts. So wider security sector reform, rule of law, judicial work to try to calibrate civil society in support of their own forces, and also very important strategic communications. Bearing in mind, Hamas, as we see, are extremely adept at the propaganda game, the Palestinian Authority less so. And then as a separate line of operation, the senior leaders course, and again, it seemed to make sense to me, and my line to the Palestinian authorities was, your guys are doing great stuff as a result of their training in Jordan, the American auspices, but actually you guys, more senior, need to know how to handle these people now they've been trained. And so we constructed a 2-month course. We got some very good guys, 1 or 2 of whom had worked here before, to come out and do that, and a series of 2-month courses, and looking at the wider context, not only the sort of business about eliciting more jointry, but also the whole business about getting them to understand that it's not just Palestinian needs, Israel has needs as well, Jordan, etc., etc., getting high-level people in to help to. Human rights was a key theme of that, wider governance. And you now have close on 200 people who've gone through those courses, who've gone back in many cases with the real zest for reform from inside. Again, each syndicate room had people from all the forces, again, trying to induce jointry with quite a lot of success, and now the junior course as well. Very, very cheap at the price, funded by the Conflict Prevention Fund. A lot of you will know about it. So essentially we were funded by a mixture of DFID, FCO and MOD money. Firstly, enabled us to support high-level British objectives, and secondly, through our work, and in particular I'll come on in a moment to the work we were doing with regards to Jenin and the northern part of the West Bank, a link straight up to the top to Steve Hadley, who was at that stage the National Security Advisor before General Jim Jones, and there's no other area of British work on the ground which has that sort of linkage. Essentially what we were doing was we were complementing the top-down efforts by people like Tony Blair, who we worked with quite a lot as a quartet envoy, and others, and senior Americans, building from the bottom up, which had not happened before. I want to make a really key point, because at the end of the day, it's not about what we were doing, it's essentially about what the Palestinians were doing and where relevantly we were enabling to do it. But actually, quite, as the guys would say, as the lads would say, irregardless of what we were doing, Salam Fayyad, who, as many of you know, is a Western educated Texas University technocrat, had worked for the West Bank, very objective man, apolitical. He said to his own forces, right, guys, sort out Nablus, make it peaceful, bring law and order. So about when I first arrived, by December 2007, Nablus over a period of time changed through the operations by the Palestinians, eventually allowed by the Israelis who allowed to do these things, and then later on, mid-2008 in Jenin, and then in due course in Hebron. And if it had not been for the Israelis being satisfied by the objective operations by the Palestinians, where necessary against their own kind, the Israelis certainly wouldn't have allowed these operations to take place in Hebron, because there's a very sensitive situation there with this hardline settlement right in the middle of the city. And again, the thing which is often cited, the fact that the Gaza invasion by the Israelis at the end of 2007, early 2008, the point there was that the expectation amongst everybody was that the West Bank would, or certainly could, erupt in violence as an expression of upset about what was happening to their brothers and cousins, etc. Forget Hamas, but their fellow Palestinians down in Gaza. That did not happen because the lid was kept on it. And the final thing was that General Dayton went back to visit London. He talked at RCDS, things like that. We went to see Douglas Alexander, who is the DFID Secretary of State, also David Miliband, also senior guys in the MOD. And General Dayton got the okay from them for me to fill this particular job, the so-called czar, and slightly embarrassingly, But the point was, this was doing much more than security. It was using security as, if you like, the umbrella or the foundation for creating the conditions for much more. So my job was to use my guys and reach out beyond to other international bodies, and particularly the Palestinians and, of course, Israelis, to begin to create the conditions for economic advancement into need. And that was the space I told you about, which had historically survived very well on remittances, on people coming in to shop from outside. So to try to get that going again. And in fact, we were reinforcing what the Palestinians were already trying to do there, because the governor of Jenin Governorate, who's a guy you knew very well called Musa Kadora, already had a very good relationship with his opposite number across the Green Line in Israel. There was a guy called Danny Ater who ran that area. And the two of them were very keen together to open up the crossings in a much more friendly way, to get many more people to and fro. Once again, on the Israeli side, concerns about security have made that very slow to happen. And again, in the end, the problems become political. But we achieved some results, and it was in that context we were speaking direct to people like Steve Hadley at the top of the US. I got just a very few more slides now. I'm going to come up with a few personal tips for those of you who've, and I know lots of you, as much, if not more than I have done, have worked in these sort of strange places with local people. Expect the unexpected. As I said before, it's nearly 3,000 feet. Came out of the flat in Ramallah one morning. Couldn't even see which my car was. So it just illustrates the point. There's rather sort of tacky Christmas cards with robins and holly and snow and mangers, etc. It's not necessarily so far from the truth. Probably a barber who was, well, certainly a barber, but probably a barber who was supporting Hamas. I thought you might like the faux leopard skin cape in best Ramallah fashion style. You know, the need to get oneself about amongst local people. The West Bank. I used to do these wonderful health-giving walks in the West Bank. You see, actually, it's a beautiful place. Also, that serves to illustrate the fact that it's a very small place. You can't quite see in the photograph, but down below the high ground is the flat ground there, is Israel, and then beyond that is the Mediterranean. So, again, one understands Israel's paranoia from a geographic point of view. And then a biblical reference, the parable of the Good Samaritan. This is the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, rock-cut steps, and you see that is the Judean desert. So again, a different area further south than that last shot. So you see the arid nature of the place. But even there, February, March time, you get this light clothing of green. It's quite extraordinary what the heavy rain does for a few weeks. This was Easter Sunday in Zababdeh, which is a 70% Christian town in the northern part of the West Bank. And again, a joyous occasion by comparison to slightly stodgy Easter Sundays in this country, where Al-Messiah Khan, the Lord has risen, was accompanied by thousands of firecrackers as all the kids let rip outside. Those are really my messages in terms of how to survive and thrive in these places. It does certainly help to have worked in the area. The language is important. I'm sorry that General Graham, it's really through him that I'm here in the first place, because I've known him since CCF days at school. General Graham read classical Arabic at Cambridge, so a man really who should have been, the 6 years I spent living in the Middle East, he really should have been doing those things. I'm not saying I should have necessarily done the sort of jobs he's done. He would himself understand in terms of interface with the Arabs and many other peoples, the importance of those. And one's got to enjoy being with them, and one's got to spend time. You know, there's a sort of slight cliche, well, them talking to us as the Afghans do to us. You may have the watches, but we've got the time. I mean, time is of a different order there, and it's important just to spend time. I think one needs to be very happy to live in a situation where things are not clear-cut and where process is not just around the corner. I mean, the first few weeks there, I had a blissful time. I had no staff, no interpreter, no driver, not even a laptop. And it meant that I could get out and do exactly what I should have been getting out and doing, which is just spending lots and lots of time with local people, understanding their perceptions, and beginning, in a very nascent way, to form some views, rather than spouting on the basis of what I might have read or heard previously. And I think this I feel extremely strongly about, and I would, again, I don't want to get into another side argument, but I mean, the fact we can send guys, especially in jobs like intelligence, to places like Afghanistan for 6 months. I mean, risible is the right word, quite frankly, risible. And I mean, I was originally due to go there for 6 months. I extended to 8 months in order to avoid getting back to MOD, because my boss had kindly said they'd keep my job open for 6 months if I came back in 6 months. And then I rapidly found myself doing 15 months. And as you can imagine, 15 months, you're still learning a hell of a lot. And I'm not saying you're not useful in the first 6 months, but certainly you need longer there to become properly useful and to build the relationships, and that's with both sides. These are my conclusions. As always, as we all know in this room, but a lot of people forget, interesting commentary on the Israelis, many of whom say they are prepared to live in the way they are now. what are the Israelis' alternatives? The one-state solution, which most of them would not like because it makes dreams about a Jewish state become untenable in terms of the numbers. A two-state solution, which is official policy, by most people in the West certainly, or continuing what they're doing now, which is occupation more or less. And it is amazing how many Israelis you talk to who say, well, if we need to, we'll just keep doing this. Our sons, our grandsons, they can keep doing this. But for us, security is very important, but it's not an end in itself. It's a means to an end as a platform to do all this other stuff. This is completely important. I think Tony Blair himself would admit that after being appointed as the Quartet envoy, he would have been quite surprised to find out, funny old thing, that shaking Ehud Olmert's hand and thinking you've got agreement doesn't necessarily translate into agreement all the way down. And Israel, compared to the system we have in this country, again, I'm not trying to be judgmental, but it's different. I would use the word dysfunctional, I suppose. That is a judgmental term. But the point is, just because the Prime Minister wants something to happen doesn't mean the Defence Minister does, which in turn does not mean their MOD does, which in turn does not mean the Israeli Defence Force does. And, funny old thing, does certainly not mean the man on the ground, the sort of soldier, private soldier, who's probably a conscript doing his national service or her national service, operating at checkpoints through which lots of Palestinians are trying to pass in the West Bank, in turn doesn't mean that they are prepared to do or want to do what their boss wants them to do. So really, this absolutely consistent approach, and one of the things we were trying to do with Janine was join up all the international players to begin to get a common understanding of what buttons to press with Israelis, and always the same message. And then there was less chance of being reduced down to their favourite approach, which is incremental, small details, one step forward, one step back. This, indeed, again, that's an allusion to the need in due course. Heaven knows how at the moment. Syria is easier than Iran. But I think the Israelis would be much happier coming to some sort of peace and formation of a Palestinian state if they could understand, if they could accept, if they could get a wider agreement. Critically important, and I suppose the sort of main basis for my conversations at the end of the day with the Israelis was, listen guys, please, you've got to make concessions. I know it's taking a risk in terms of security, but unless you make concessions, unless you acknowledge and recognise that the Palestinians are trying hard on their own security, you will undermine the moderates. The same with what we were doing in Jenin. Unless you give latitude and allow a bit of trade to happen, the moderates will not survive. And it's in your interest, Israelis, to do that, because otherwise the alternative is these guys, extremists, Hamas, with the constant message that negotiations get you nowhere, you fellow Palestinians, the only way to do this is back to violence. They will be preeminent. And what I find depressing is, unlike our experience with Sinn Féin, where in the end the whole business was to try to get a more moderate stream of Republicanism emerging, where the extremists were more and more pushed to the edge. In my conversations with Israelis, many of them, people I knew extremely well, intelligent people, refused to accept that there was any possibility that a Hamas man could be anything other than a terrorist or terrorist supporter ever. And they probably would say, well, that's their experience. But the point was that was their line. This is critical, and that's what we were trying to do, join the bottom up with the top down. This also, I think it's self-evident, it took me time to realise it. You go back to a man like Yitzhak Rabin, who had been a hardline defence minister, became Israeli Prime Minister, had the Damascene moment for whatever reason, decided that this hardline security could not continue, made overtures, and tragically, and this is often the theme, was actually assassinated by a right-wing Israeli, not somebody from the other side. But at the end of the day, you need to have people on both sides who have both the vision, the conviction and the commitment to get their own people out of the trenches to get them to move forward. Because top-down, bottom-up can achieve a certain amount. End of the day, the people need to be brought forward. To what extent Obama could talk direct to the Israeli people rather than using their leaders as intermediaries, I don't know. But the man has a gift of speaking to the people. Maybe it's something he could try. Again, in sort of standard mediation terms, it's about both sides being convinced that it could be win-win. Win-lose, as we all know as military men, is not sustainable in the long term. And then this point here, many people did become more cynical, as even while I was there. They said actually making efforts just serves to disappoint, just serves to make people cynical. It serves to strengthen the Hamas propaganda that actually making peaceful efforts achieves nothing. So there are people who say, look, it's best just not to try. Going to the very last point, and a point I'll end up with, George Mitchell, who I was privileged enough to spend time with, a real veteran, and a man who I describe as, most unusually, a really active listener. I mean, just oozed from his pores. You could see him bringing everything in. And a veteran peacemaker, and certainly did play a key part in Northern Ireland, but I was talking there about a bracket of some 5 years. The view is here, this is rather more urgent than that. But his view was, yes, humans can create, do conduct, do sustain conflict, but they can also end it.
Please note that any views expressed in this presentation are entirely and solely those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the official thinking and policy of their organisation, Her Majesty's Government, or the Ministry of Defence.